We have here for political sciences the chair from this section, Stephan Grigat. He is a well-known scholar in this field, is one of the few scholars who always have the courage to stand up against very violent antisemitism and anti-Zionism in Germany and in Austria. Please.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Before I start my talk, I would like to do the same thing as my colleagues Frank Stern and Klaus Davidowitz. I want to express my gratitude, and I would like to say thanks again to the students who staged this little and silent protest yesterday. And actually I was quite shocked how they were treated. I know not only the students, I also know and work together with the organizations they represent, the Austrian Students' Union and especially also the Jewish Union of Students of Austria. And they are not like stupid leftists who just saw an opportunity to protest against right-wing anti-Semitism because they don't like the right. Yesterday, they staged a protest against right-wing anti-Semitism, but on other occasions, they're also fighting against anti-Semitism in the left. Every time when there's an BDS event, these are the people and these are the organizations who show up and take part in the protest against it. And also when my organization with others organized protests against the Iranian regime here in Vienna at the occasion of Al-Quds March, it were these organizations who were here yesterday who joined our protest. So please let me say I'm very proud that we have students like them here at the University of Vienna. So, something completely different now. I would like to talk about 4 topics in order to at least attempt to address some of the points raised in the political studies panels, which I chaired together actually with Karin Stögner from the Vienna University. First, what does critical theory of anti-Semitism mean and what problems for the fight against anti-Semitism does it bring to light? Second, some brief remarks regarding right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism. Third, the anti-Semitism of the Ayatollahs and the question of whether it is still relevant. And finally, I will outline some concrete measures for the struggle against anti-Semitism, focusing on its most dangerous contemporary manifestations at global level. So, on the first point. The purpose of a critique of anti-Semitism is to disable it and to decipher it through a critique of ideology. Any reconstruction of the mentality of the antisemite, however transient, and any account of the history of anti-Semitism, however comprehensive, ends up in stunned amazement at the projective madness of the Jew hatred. As Maximilian Gottschlich once put it, and I quote, "When all is said and done, there's only one serious motive for concerning oneself with anti-Semitism, to resist it," end of quote. However, if we wish to resist it without illusions, a critical reconstruction of the anti-Semitic mentality is essential. In some established academic schools of thought, the impression is given that anti-Semitism is a result of a lack of knowledge about Jews, Judaism, or the Jewish state. I think that this idea is not only wrong, but also underestimates the problem. Were it correct, the situation would not be nearly so bad and could be easily addressed. For example, through meetings between Jewish and non-Jewish young people, synagogue open days, and study trips to Israel. And of course, all these things should be done. However, they will not banish anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is a comprehensive worldview of a delusional, projective kind. Instead of downplaying anti-Semitism as a mere prejudice, we have to decipher it through a critique of the anti-Semitic society, as Adorno and Horkheimer put it in their dialectic of enlightenment. Anti-Semitism is not an anthropological constant, but an ever-changing delusional reaction to the historically existing society. Modern anti-Semitism is essentially a reaction to an uncomprehended, fetishistic, and self-mystifying capitalist society. The urge for a delusional concretization of abstraction which seems to me to be one of the decisive elements of anti-Semitism, this urge for a delusional concretization of abstraction is inherent to modern capitalist society. The task to any materialist critique of anti-Semitism is to make visible the connection between the antisemites and the society that produces them. At the same time, however, we must make it clear that this connection exculpates neither the antisemite nor the society. Anti-Semitism is a regressive revolt against the global principle of subjectless rule and an abstractness of the economy and of politics that is perceived as a burden and a threat. Understood in this way, anti-Semitism is a basic ideology of a capitalist society, a society that produces its own negation both positively and negatively. The critique of the fetishism and mystification of capitalist society, developed in Karl Marx's Critique of Political Economy, is, in my opinion, of decisive importance for the critique of this ideological worldview. The conceptual sharpness of the developed critique of political economy is necessary in order to prevent, or at least decisively impede, the mutation of economic criticism into anti-Semitic resentment. A critique of anti-Semitism must show that it's not simply a form of racism directed against Jews. This does, of course, not mean that it must be fought more than racism, but it does mean keeping in mind the different modes of operation of racism and anti-Semitism in order to be able to combat them more effectively. Anti-Semites imagine their prospective victims not as powerless, but as all-powerful. As the embodiment of abstraction, in the eyes of anti-Semites, Jews rule the whole world, something which in the minds of racists would be beyond the capacity of the victims of racism. Or to put it in another way, nobody fantasizes about an African world conspiracy. Anti-Semites fantasize about their destruction by a superior intellect, the masters of money, or a Jewish statehood that is deemed illegitimate. For a critical theory, a critique of anti-Semitism is concerned not with the objects, but the subjects of anti-Semitism. So not with the Jews, Judaism or the Jewish state, but with the psychic needs and the sometimes conscious and sometimes unconscious motives of the Jew hater. In a delusional projection onto the so-called Jewish principle and its supposed physical embodiments, anti-Semites are fighting against social and individual ambivalences. And they are fighting against individual and social contradictions and crises. This seems to me to be the constant factor in the very different manifestations of anti-Semitism. One means for combating these anti-Semitic reactions would be the mass education of thinking individuals so that they learn to deal with these individual and social ambivalences, contradictions, and crises in a mature and responsible way. However, in the critique of anti-Semitism, one must constantly keep in mind the limits of enlightenment, a phrase that not by chance was used by Adorno and Horkheimer as a subtitle for the famous essay, Elements of Antisemitism. So, wherever feasible, social relations should be established that promote an essential minimum of individual and social reflection and the formation of an effective maturity. The problem, however, is the following. Modern forms of socialization both create and sabotage the possibilities of the formation of such an reflective, mature individuality. To keep in mind the limits of enlightenment means, where the above is impossible, we have to prevent the anti-Semites from pursuing their goals by all available means. Adorno himself stated that in the face of blatant anti-Semitism, the available means of coercion should be used, as he put it, without sentimentality. And I think this is true both within the framework of the nation state and in the confrontation with anti-Semitic actors on the international stage. In the face of the anti-Semitic agitation, we are not powerless. anti-Semitism can, in the last analysis, only be made to disappear through the abolition of its social foundation. An end to anti-Semitism would therefore ultimately mean the establishment of a society free from domination and exploitation, in which everyone could be different without fear or pressure. However, even in this society, the arm of criticism and the criticism of arms, to paraphrase the young Marx, are also effective against anti-Semitic agitation and practice. Every action, whether political or even military, that is directed towards the prevention of anti-Semitic practice and propaganda is proof that genuinely, effectively resistance to anti-Semitism is possible. However, these urgently necessary defensive measures cannot put an end to anti-Semitism. The simultaneous necessity of both a fundamental critique of society and urgent action against immediate anti-Semitic threats highlights the tension between the categorical imperatives of Karl Marx and Theodor W. Adorno. Today, it is urgently necessary to stick to Marx's demand to, and I quote, to overturn all relations in which man is a humiliated, enslaved, forsaken, and contemptible being, end of quote, in order to maintain at least the theoretical possibility to really bring an end to anti-Semitism. At the same time, we must also keep in mind the need, to quote Adorno's new categorical imperative, the need for unfree mankind to arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen, end of quote. Taking this in mind, the analysis of the geopolitical reproduction of anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism is today a central task for a critical theory of anti-Semitism. When, at demonstrations in Germany, Hamas and Hezbollah flags are quite openly displayed, and phrases such as "Jew, Jew, cowardly pig, come out and fight alone" are shouted without any interference from the German police, and when a leader of a NATO member country, Turkey, states that the defensive measures taken by Israel against Hamas and Islamic Jihad are worse than the barbarism of Nazis, without this having any consequences, then we get an idea of the isolation of the Jewish state. And so, at the practical level, we must counter this isolation with educational programs that convey a realistic picture of the Israeli-Arab conflict. In discussions about this conflict, one constantly comes up against the assertion that anti-Semitism in the Arab and Islamic world is a result of this conflict. Against this, educational efforts on all levels must explain the extent to which Arab and Islamic anti-Semitism are central causes of this conflict. In the academic sphere, we need institutes devoted to the criticism of anti-Semitism that do not restrict themselves to historical research into European Jew hatred, but make a priority of the study of contemporary Israel-fixated anti-Semitism. And this brings me on to my second point, some very brief remarks on right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism. As the historically decisive protagonist of blatant anti-Semitism, the right has, of course, deserved special attention. It would be a grave error, rightly, to target implicit, secondary, and structural anti-Semitic arguments from the left, while giving a pass to the right. Just as with the left, we must consider how parties such as the AfD, FPÖ, or Front National, without resorting to openly anti-Semitic arguments, nonetheless promote an anti-Semitic worldview. Quite clearly, developments relating to anti-Semitism are taking place within the parties on the right-wing end of the political spectrum today. And if, in fact, a firmly anti-Semitic right were to develop, this would really offer some relief to Europe's Jewish communities and would provide Israel with far greater room for maneuver in its European alliances. However, the actions of parties like AfD and FPÖ rather look like an exploitation of the issue rather than a serious attempt at a critique of anti-Semitism. In a nutshell, and to keep it short, even though what my colleague Gerhard Scheidt has aptly described as these parties' simulation of Israel's solidarity is certainly better than the open hostility towards Israel displayed by sections of the left, such parties cannot, of course, be allies in the fight against anti-Semitism. And I would say that becomes already very clear if we keep in mind that the FPÖ-nominated foreign minister here in Austria, Karin Kneißl, described Zionism as, and I quote, a blood and soil ideology. If so, a few words also very short about the left. The existence of anti-Semitic resentment on the left is today evident, and in the light of the abundant evidence repeatedly proving the point, the persistent denial of some of the problem can only be seen as one of its forms of expression. In the decades after 1945, it was the left, especially in Germany and Austria, that transformed the dictum, never again Auschwitz, never again war, into the dogma, never again war against anti-Semitism. After Israel has, however, been forced to do exactly that, this dogma has become one of the key rationales for the delegitimization of Zionism. And this leads to the absurd situation where criticism of the military assertiveness of the Jewish state is proclaimed as a lesson learned from National Socialism. In order, however, to avoid any misunderstanding, the critique of left-wing anti-Semitism must not become a pretext for the abandonment of ideas of general human emancipation. On the contrary, in my opinion, the task is to criticize Marxism with Marx and the left with the critical theory of Adorno and Horkheimer. From the practical point of view, that simply means we need much more critical theory at the universities. If the left were to take the categorical imperative of Adorno seriously, it would have to be on the front line fighting against the delegitimization of Israel and against the threats that are emanating from the Iranian regime, Sunni Islamists, and their European supporters. Were the left to concern itself in the tradition of Marx with the full freedom of the individual, it would never march under the banners of Islamist terror groups such as Hamas or Hezbollah, which brings me to my third point. We have heard already a lot about Islamic anti-Semitism in general during the last few days. Let me exemplify the problem with reference to the Iranian regime, a regime that today stands at the borders of the Jewish state. Almost all topoi of modern anti-Semitism, as described by Adorno and Horkheimer, can be found in the Iranian Islamists' ideology. In particular, a glorification of a concretely transfigured, organic, authentic, destiny-fulfilling, and harmonious community, on the one hand, seen as the opposite of a chaotic, abstract, alienated, rotten, artificial, immoral, materialist, conflict-ridden, and, in the last analysis, Jew-associated social model. For the Iranian dictatorship, the Middle Eastern conflict is not about improving the lot of the Palestinians, a two-state solution, or any kind of agreement or compromise, but explicitly about destroying Israel. In 2012, to give you just one example from the time before Hassan Rouhani became president, the supreme leader Ali Khamenei described Israel as, I quote, a cancerous tumor that should be cut and will be cut. This is advocated not only by the supporters of ex-President Ahmadinejad, but also by those ayatollahs who are treated by the West as pragmatists, moderates, or reformists. But the founder of the Islamic Republic, Khomeini, was not only hostile to the Jewish state, but openly proclaimed his enmity towards the Jews. In a classic case of projection of his own megalomania, Khomeini believed himself engaged in a struggle against an unfolding plan for Jewish world domination about which he had already fantasized in his central text, Islamic Government. A major role in the spread of anti-Semitism in Iran has been played by the Persian translation of the anti-Semitic screed, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. First published in 1978, large print runs of several new editions have since been issued by official Iranian bodies, sometimes with modified titles such as The Protocols of the Jewish Leaders for the Domination of the World. In the Iranian regime's ideology, Zionism is attacked not as an everyday political opponent, but as a root cause of almost all the world's problems, whose destruction would pave the way to salvation. One tool in gaining this kind of salvation is Holocaust denial. And that's not only true for the so-called hardliners. To give you again just one example, former President Mohammad Khatami, who some years ago actually was invited to this university, former President Mohammad Khatami, who to this day is regarded as a shining example of a reformist Islamist, positioned himself as one of the most passionate defenders of the French Holocaust denier, Roger Garaudy, whom he invited to Tehran. Contrary to the impression given by much of the Western media, the election of Rouhani as Iran's president has not led to any significant change. In my opinion, he could be best described as the friendly face of terror. Since he took office, Rouhani, like his predecessors, has been a regular attender of the annual Al-Quds March in Tehran that openly calls for the destruction of Israel. Even as regards Holocaust denial, we see continuity. In 2014, so 1 year after the election of Rouhani, the Ayatollahs once again gave a platform to a gathering of Holocaust deniers from all over the world in Tehran. In 2017, Rouhani repeated one of Khamenei's catchphrases when he assailed Israel as a cancerous tumor, having previously described the Jewish state already as a festering tumor. In 2017, Khamenei proclaimed Western liberal ideas about equality of the sexes to be, I quote, a Zionist plot, thus demonstrating that the intimate connection between anti-Semitism and sexism is not the exclusive property of the European far right. Referring to Israel, he reiterated his view, to quote for last time Ali Khamenei, that there is no cure for the problem that this savage and wolfish regime has created except its destruction and annihilation, end of quote. In the light of all this, which brings me to my final point, we need an anti-fascism that opposes every form of counter-enlightenment. The currently dominant left and liberal anti-fascisms, which focus on the European far-right parties, have to confront some questions, especially the question of why several thousand people rightly demonstrate in Vienna against, for example, the FPÖ's academic ball, but only a handful turn out when representatives of the Iranian regime are welcomed here in Vienna or in Berlin by the highest officials of state with full pomp and ceremony. And why can tens of thousands be mobilized for marches against the AfD, for very good reasons, but only 100 when supporters of the openly anti-Semitic Hamas hold events not in Ramallah or in Gaza, but in the German capital, Berlin? What we urgently need is a cosmopolitan critique of Islam and Islamism, which also, of course, opposes nationalist xenophobes of every stripe. We must argue against the cultural relativism used by both the right-wing ethno-pluralists and many left-wing apologists for Islam and radical Islamism. Instead, we should recall the slogan raised by tens of thousands of women who demonstrated in 1979 against the imposition of the headscarf in Iran. Emancipation is not Western or Eastern, but universal. Against this background, in addition to the already mentioned necessary tasks relating to the strengthening of mature individuals and political education, against this background, we must make the following priorities in the fight against anti-Semitism. Deciphering anti-Semitism from the right and the left, consistently fighting all anti-Semitic Islamic movements, backing the overthrow of the Iranian regime, and supporting Israeli self-defense. In the first place, that means the necessity to fight against European appeasement of Islamic anti-Semitism and against European cooperation with anti-Semitic regimes. Concretely, that means European government, and I think that is one of the most important points if we want to fight anti-Semitism today, European governments must ban and punish trade with the Iranian regime rather than promoting it as they currently do. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards must immediately be placed on the list of terrorist organizations, and here too belongs Hezbollah as a whole and not, like now, just its military wing, in order to put a stop to its fundraising activities in Europe. Finally, let me quickly illustrate my criticism of a mere rhetorical fight against anti-Semitism with reference to some of the supporters of this very conference. The fact that every Austrian province has sponsored, you can see it over there, the fact that every Austrian province has sponsored this conference is of course to be welcomed. But what are we to make of the fact that companies from these federal states are doing business with the Holocaust deniers in Iran with public support? It is gratifying that Mayor Michael Heupel invited us to the opening reception of this conference to the very nice City Hall of Vienna. But if he is really serious about the struggle against anti-Semitism, why did he make a courtesy visit to Tehran in 2016? It is very good that the Austrian president sent an opening speech to this conference. But if he's serious about fighting anti-Semitism, why then, in 2017, did he meet the president of the Iranian regime? It is certainly helpful that the Austrian Foreign Ministry is backing this conference. But let us not forget that this very ministry has hosted Manouchehr Mottaki, who, as Iranian foreign minister, gave the opening speech to the 2010 Holocaust Denial conference in Tehran. And let us not forget that Sebastian Kurz, when he was foreign minister, also made a courtesy visit to Iran. And let us not forget that the present foreign ministry gave absolutely no support to the brave demonstrators who, at the turn of the year, raised slogans against Hezbollah in Iranian cities at risk of their life. Actually, at the very same moment, in the Internal Security Report of Austria, Hezbollah is not even mentioned. So to draw these concluding points together, and once again emphasize, taking Adorno's categorical imperative seriously today means giving all possible support to Israel and its armed forces in their defensive struggle against anti-Semitism, while focusing criticism in both the academic and political sphere on the anti-Israeli resentment, while also at the very same time targeting the old anti-Semitism, for example, of the Austrian and German fraternities. And taking Adorno's categorical imperative seriously means above all today consistently fighting all sorts of Islamism and denying any support to the Iranian regime in order to finally overthrow it. Thank you very much.